The sound of dry leaves crunching beneath her feet grew louder with every step she took. A cold autumn wind blew her hair across her face. The sky was dark, with a thin mist hanging over the graves. There were no lights around, only the faint, eerie glow of the moon breaking through the clouds. Emily's breaths grew heavy. Her heart pounded in her chest, faster with each step. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching her from behind. Cautiously, she glanced over her shoulder. There was no one, but the fear gnawing at her remained, growing stronger with each passing second. She pressed on, heading toward her mother's grave. The wilting daffodils in her hand seemed as lifeless as the night itself. When she finally reached the grave, a faint whispering filled the air, a voice that seemed to rise from the ground itself. Emily froze in place. She strained her ears, trying to locate the source of the sound. It wasn't just the wind, no. This was different. It was a voice, human, but not of this world. A voice that said, "We see you." Her hands trembled. Cold sweat dripped down her forehead. With a quivering voice, she whispered, "Mom?" No response came, but another voice, low and cold, whispered right beside her ear, "She is not here." Emily spun around, her eyes wide with terror. There was no one there, yet the weight of invisible eyes bore down on her. She took a step back, but her foot caught on something. She tumbled to the ground, and a faint, eerie moan echoed from the earth. She looked down, pale, skeletal hands were reaching out from the dirt. Her breath caught in her throat. Shaking, she reached for the ground to push herself up, but suddenly the earth beneath her gave way. She fell into a dark, yawning hole. The ground seemed to come alive, and sinister laughter and distant cries of spirits echoed from every direction. She hit the bottom hard, pain shooting through her body. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the cemetery. She found herself in a cramped, suffocating room, surrounded by coffins. The walls were cold and damp stone, and the stench of decay filled the air. A dim light flickered from a single candle, casting eerie shadows across the coffins. Then one of the coffins creaked open. Emily stared in horror as a figure slowly began to rise from inside. A face, pale and lifeless, eyes that held no light, a spirit crawling out, inching closer to her. She couldn't move. Her legs were frozen with fear. The whispers of the dead still filled the air. "Run if you can." But she couldn't. The spirit drew closer, its cold, deathly breath brushing against her face. Her heart stopped, and darkness swallowed her whole. And in that final moment, the only sound left was the echo of a sinister laugh that would haunt Emily for all eternity. It was well past midnight. A heavy mist, like an invisible shroud, hung over the entire cemetery, swallowing any movement that dared to disturb the stillness. John stepped out of the old guard shack. Every night, he worked here alone. This cemetery had its share of ghost stories, but John never paid much attention to them. Tonight, like any other night, an eerie silence blanketed the area. John walked toward the older part of the cemetery. He left behind the newer, neatly arranged graves, and entered the area where the headstones were cracked, moss-covered, and forgotten. The cold night air gnawed at his bones. He reached into his coat pocket to grab a match, but before he could light it, he felt something strange in the air. His gaze shifted to the left. It felt as though something or someone was watching him from between the graves. But all he could see was darkness. John took a few cautious steps forward, wiping sweat from his brow. The cold seemed unusually intense. Slowly, he moved closer to the graves. His steps were heavy and deliberate. Suddenly, a muffled sound rose from one of the graves, a sound that resembled a distant moan. John stopped in his tracks. He strained his ears, listening intently. The sound came again, but this time it was closer. He looked around in fear. Nothing was visible, but his heart began to race. Now the sound seemed to come from beneath him, right from under the ground. It was as though someone or something was trying to rise from beneath the soil. John stepped back, staring at the earth in disbelief. Could it be just his imagination? His hands trembled. He couldn't keep his composure any longer. He turned to flee, but a voice, louder and more terrifying, called out from behind him. "Don't go. It's not too late for you." John gasped, but it was as though something had stolen the strength from his voice. He turned his head, breathing heavily, but saw nothing but the dark expanse of the cemetery. Whatever it was, either it was in his mind or... Suddenly, he felt something cold touch his shoulder, like a hand made of ice. His arms were glued to his sides, paralyzed. He struggled to breathe, but the cold, heavy air was like an invisible hand squeezing his throat. He could hear slow, deliberate footsteps behind him. He didn't dare turn around. He knew if he did, he would come face to face with something he couldn't escape. The sound of heavy, ragged breathing filled his ears. Whatever it was right behind him. "You cannot escape us." With all his strength, John finally turned around, his eyes wide with terror. But all he saw was darkness. There was no figure. Yet the oppressive weight of an unseen presence still pressed against him. He started to walk faster, only one thought in his mind. "I have to get out of here." The faster he walked, the closer the sound got. It was as if an invisible entity was pursuing him, getting closer with every step. Suddenly, a blood-curdling scream echoed in the distance. John didn't stop, but the scream rattled in his mind, fueling his growing fear. His feet caught on the tangled roots of the old, decaying trees, and he fell to the ground. The cold earth of the cemetery quickly closed around him. John tried to pull himself up, but the more he struggled, the more the ground beneath him seemed to give way. It felt as though the earth itself was swallowing him. "Help!" he yelled, but no answer came. A soft, eerie laugh rose from the ground, and then a hand broke through the soil. The hand was pale and cold, as if it had just risen from the grave. It clawed its way toward John. He struggled desperately to break free, but the hand latched onto him, dragging him toward the grave. He frantically tried to pull away, but with every movement, more hands reached out from the earth. In one last desperate effort, he tore himself free from the decaying roots and sprinted toward the cemetery gates. The sound of eerie laughter and ghostly moans echoed in his ears, but all he could think about was escape. He just needed to get out. But just before he reached the gate, the cold, menacing voice whispered once more, "This is only the beginning." The air was cold and damp. A thick mist had settled over the cemetery, casting shadows over the tombstones. Silence hung heavily in the air, broken only by the faint chirping of crickets and the soft whistle of the wind through the dead branches of the trees. Jack stood over the grave, shovel in hand. His face, pale and tense under the dim moonlight, looked emotionless, but his eyes betrayed his unease. He had never imagined his life would come to this. Grave robbing, at midnight no less. But he wasn't doing this for money or some twisted thrill. Jack needed answers. Answers buried deep beneath the soil in this forgotten grave. Secrets that had haunted him for years. His hands ached from the effort. The dirt was heavier and harder than he had anticipated. Suddenly, a soft rustling sound echoed in the distance. Jack froze, his shovel midair. He looked around, scanning the dark horizon. Nothing moved. The silence of the cemetery returned, but Jack felt eyes watching him from the shadows. Taking a deep breath, Jack continued to dig, his determination stronger now, though his heart pounded faster. Every shovelful of dirt seemed to bring that unsettling sound closer. It wasn't coming from the trees or the wind anymore. It was coming from beneath the ground. Cold sweat dripped down his face. He paused, staring at the dirt. He was close now. Only a thin layer of earth separated him from the truth. But was he ready to face whatever lay beneath? Could he handle what was about to come? With trembling hands, Jack removed the last bit of dirt, revealing the old, decaying wooden coffin. The wood was brittle, worn by years of rot. Jack hesitated, his breath quickening as he felt a strange pressure in the air. It was as if something or someone was trying to keep him from opening the coffin. Jack wiped his brow, shaking off the creeping fear. With a sharp tug, he pried open the coffin lid. The smell hit him first, stale, foul, like something long dead. A sudden wave of icy cold air surged from the coffin, freezing him in place. Inside, the body was motionless, just a skeleton wrapped in decayed clothing. But what made Jack's blood run cold wasn't the corpse itself. It was the overwhelming sense that he wasn't alone. A strange, heavy presence filled the air around him, and he could hear it now, soft, ragged breathing, but it wasn't his. Jack stumbled back, his heart racing. Shadows, unnatural and formless, began to creep from the corners of the grave, twisting and turning as they approached him. The whispers were clearer now, surrounding him. "Why are you here?" Jack couldn't speak. He could only retreat further, away from the grave. The shadows grew thicker, their presence more menacing. The spirits, restless and angry, surrounded him, warning him that he had crossed a line he should never have approached. "You shouldn't have done this." Jack's eyes darted back to the coffin. A dark figure stood over it now, tall, featureless, a silhouette in the moonlight. His breath caught in his throat. There was no time to think. The figure moved closer, its presence overwhelming. "Leave before it's too late." But Jack couldn't move. He was frozen in place, the cold numbing his body, his mind paralyzed with fear. The shadows circled him, their whispers growing more frantic. The spirits didn't want their graves disturbed, and now Jack would pay the price for his trespass. His vision blurred, the darkness closing in. The last thing he heard was the cold, chilling laughter of the dead, echoing from beneath the ground. The night was cold and dark. A faint wind rustled through the trees of the cemetery, carrying with it the sound of dry leaves. Jack, the elderly cemetery watchman, walked between the tombstones with a flashlight in hand. His duty was clear, patrolling the grounds at night and maintaining peace. But tonight was unlike any other. A few days ago, some young people had dared to dig up the grave of a young girl named Emily. Since then, rumors of strange noises and mysterious shadows in the cemetery had circulated. Jack had initially dismissed these rumors, but tonight he had an uneasy feeling, a feeling that he should stay away from Emily's grave. Jack approached Emily's grave, his feet seemingly drawn to it. He stopped and looked at the headstone, shining his flashlight on it. Everything seemed normal, but at that moment, he heard a faint, eerie laugh. Jack turned off his flashlight to listen more clearly, but the silence returned. His heart raced, and his hands grew colder. He wanted to move on, but something inside him made him hesitate. Then the laugh came again, this time clearer and closer. Jack looked around nervously. There was no one there. His heart pounded harder. The laughter had turned into a high-pitched, joyful sound, as if a young girl were laughing loudly, right behind him. Jack spun around. There was no one, but the air had grown heavy. The scent of damp flowers and fresh soil filled his nostrils. He heard a faint, whispering voice calling his name. Jack! Jack! His vision blurred. He was certain now that he was not alone. The voice came from Emily's grave. Jack stood still. The ground beneath him felt heavy and cold, as if the entire weight of the cemetery had been placed on his shoulders. Then, the headstone began to tremble softly. Something was slowly emerging from the ground. Jack turned the flashlight back on, but its beam was weak. A small, delicate hand appeared from the dirt. A cold, pale hand belonging to a teenage girl. Jack recoiled in terror, his breath catching in his throat. The hand continued to rise, followed by a face, Emily's face, the girl whose grave had been disturbed. Her expression was emotionless, but her eyes locked onto Jack's. Her lips slowly moved. Why did you dig up my grave? Jack's breath was shallow. His tongue felt tied, and his body was frozen. He wanted to run, but his feet felt rooted to the ground. Emily moved closer, but she was not alone. Other shadows, spirits of girls buried mysteriously in the cemetery, emerged from the earth and moved toward Jack. Jack managed to drag himself toward the cemetery gates. His legs were trembling, and his breath was erratic. Just as he reached the gates and reached for the lock, Emily's loud, piercing voice echoed in his ears. "You can't escape, Watchman." Suddenly, the sounds of chains and locks echoed. The cemetery gates were barred shut, and Jack could no longer leave. All the spirits of the girls were now standing behind him. He turned slowly, his eyes wide with terror, but it was too late to escape.